Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the third in Kellogg College's Bletchley Park week of events entitled Bletchley, Code-Breaking and World War II in Asia. My name is Kevin Knowles, and I'm a doctoral candidate in history at Oxford and will be acting as the chair for the event. And we will have three speakers today who I will introduce shortly. Now, the format today will involve the speakers making opening remarks with questions taken afterwards. I'd encourage you to use the chat facility to ask questions, which I will then read out, although we'll also potentially take questions in person later as well. Now, given the number of attendees today, I would appreciate it if you could keep your video off and your microphones muted for the time being, please. Hopefully, we'll move forward on that basis. So in terms of the speakers themselves, we've got three very distinguished speakers today. Firstly, Dr. Yasmin Khan is a British historian and writer and lecturer at the University of Oxford, specialising in British history from the 18th to the early 20th century. She's a fellow of Kellogg College and senior tutor. Her research focuses on the history of the British in India, the British Empire, South Asian decolonization, refugees, and the aftermath of empire. And her books have included The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan, and more recently, The Rajat War, A People's History of India's Second World War. Professor Ashley Jackson is Professor of Imperial and Military History at King's College London and a visiting fellow at Kellogg College. A prolific author, he has published widely on aspects of British imperial history with a special interest in the empire during times of war, and with regional specialisms in the history of Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Middle East. His recent books have included Of Islands, Ports, and Sea Lanes, the Second World War in Africa and the Indian Ocean, and Ceylon at War, 1939 to 45. Dr. David Kenyon is responsible for historical research in support of all the public content at the museum at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, including exhibition material, visitor tours, web information, and broadcast items. His latest book, entitled Bletchley Park and D-Day, was published in 2019 and emphasized the role of Bletchley as a fully developed intelligence agency and not just as a code-breaking establishment. Prior to his role at Bletchley Park, he worked as a freelance military historian and museum consultant and was involved in numerous historical TV and film projects. So, with the introductions over, I would like to ask Dr. Yasmin Khan to begin the speaker contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin, and it's great to be part of this roundtable. I know the title of this roundtable is Bletchley, Intelligence and the War in Asia. I'm going to be talking much more about the war in Asia than about intelligence, because I know quite a lot about the war in Asia and very little about intelligence, and then our speakers who follow are going to have much more to say about the intelligence and about Bletchley specifically. So I want to just, in my sort of 10 minutes, just set out the context for what will follow and the way in which the war impacted Asia. And I think Bletchley is obviously a very British institution, and we think of it in association with events in Britain and code-breaking in Britain. But the empire was really the context of the whole war. When Churchill gave his speech about the finest hour, he said, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves so that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say this was their finest hour." So note there, it's the Empire and the Commonwealth that are featured. And contemporaries very much saw this in that light. And the war in Asia really involved a lot of British civilians, a lot of British soldiers, and people from all across the world. It was a theatre which brought in America, China, Japan, Australia. It really is where the World War was fought. So I want to kind of emphasize some of those things today, and also the implications and repercussions for some of the colonial and colonized people who were resident in those regions. Many of you will be aware that over the years there's been much more attention to the role of Imperial and Commonwealth soldiers in the British war efforts. There's been far more attention to that in recent years. But I've been engaged, and with Ashley Jackson also, who's here today, we had an AHRC project together, and trying to think about the social implications on the home fronts of Asia and Africa for ordinary people who were caught up in this maelstrom of a war. So if I could have some slides, please, Shabazz. I will talk you through some images which relate to that. Apologies if this is familiar to you and you already are a war buff, but just to show the kind of dramatic sweep of the Japanese in 1942 through Asia, and the way that Singapore, which was the fortress, fell was really kind of struck to the core of British defence, and also shattered morale and really made people very, very scared. There was a very big and quick and rapid sweep right through. You can see present-day Thailand, through into Burma, across the Indian Ocean. India itself, for a short period of time, seemed like it might come under attack, and was actually sporadically bombed. Warships were circling Ceylon. And this was a kind of very fragile moment for the whole of the British Empire. George Orwell, in February 1942, reflected on 10 of the blackest weeks in our national and imperial history. So it's difficult to over-exaggerate how extensively the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan and the American declaration of war rebounded in the British Empire, how rapidly and dramatically it transformed the region. The Japanese toppled the British imperial presence across from Hong Kong and Singapore to Burma and the Andaman Islands. And Orwell went on, with the Japanese army in the Indian Ocean and the German armies in the Middle East, India becomes the center of the war. It's hardly an exaggeration to say, he said, the center of the world. For a long time to come, possibly years, it will have to act as a supply base from which men and munitions can be poured out in two directions, east and west. And the next slide also shows the extent of that empire. If we can move to the next one. Here we can see the sort of Axis-controlled territory that Japan took. Now, this clearly caught up in its wake all the residents of these areas, and many of them had served the British, had worked for the British in various ways, or had been networked into imperial service. But for many, many others, they're caught between really what are two opposing empires and pulled in different directions. So there's a sort of crossfire where those on the home fronts have their loyalties and disloyalties, or their attachments to nationalism, nascent nationalism, particularly in Burma, but across the region in Malaya also, and in India, strong kind of nationalist movements, very thrown into indecision and thrown into how to respond to this war, when at the same time they also feared a second form of colonialism, perhaps the incursions of the Japanese and a new and different form of empire, instead of the one which had preceded it. And so we see those debates and discussions, and also the arming of paramilitaries and militia forces that are in a way fighting sub-wars underneath the carapace of this broader war. And I think this will link to intelligence also when we think about intelligence. If we can go on to the next slide, many ordinary civilians caught up in war production, creating fabrics, textiles, military goods for the war effort. And if we go on, you see also laborers, for instance, in Burma, on the Thai railway roads, many Asian workers working with pickaxes and kind of creating the conditions through which the war could be fought by carving out railways, roads, and the infrastructure through which Americans in particular could build their air bases and start to sort of continue to bring aid to China, but also to wage the war against Japan. If we go forward, there's another one, and again, you see here Mountbatten, who was the final viceroy of India, but also the commander-in-chief of the Southeast Asian commander, inspecting troops in reoccupied Malaya. So this is a moment where there are lots of people caught up, as I've suggested, evacuees, people, Polish refugees, for instance, end up in India. There are prisoners of war, and Kevin himself may tell us a bit more about that later. Many prisoners of war whose loyalties are not exactly clear, in the sense that they have been soldiers who've been fighting for the British in the Indian Army, but then they are also, some of them, drawn to the Indian National Army headed by Subhash Chandra Bose. And I think this creates a really difficult intelligence context for the British Empire. Intelligence in domestic setting in India, which is the place I know most about, had really developed as a way of surveying nationalists. It had grown out of an imperial anxiety about threats to the state and about sedition. But now there was a kind of a much greater need, obviously, around military intelligence, which kind of overlapped with and competed with that, and a very, very complex and challenging intelligence setting, I think. Last night, those of you who heard Shribani Basu talk as part of our Bletchley Park week will have heard that she was talking about Noor Inayat Khan, who was a special operations executive who was sent into occupied France. Now, Noor was asked in an interview in London whether she really supported the Indian nationalist movement or whether she supported the British. And she was so furious. Shribani was explaining how furious and offended and upset she was by that question. But in a way, it's sort of not a surprising question, given the political context and the different demands that were being placed on these individuals. And there are others, other examples of people who are trying to find out and work out the intelligence context in a very, very sort of fraught and difficult setting. So I've seen, for instance, quotes around a police chief who was trying to establish whether there were Axis fifth columnists in India, and he found a policeman who had German parentage and who could speak German, who he ran as an undercover agent. And he ran this big network of Indian agents, including house servants, chauffeurs, the head waiter at the German club who spoke both English and German. This is obviously towards the beginning of the war. And accordingly, he said, we didn't find out much, but we were able to add to what we did know. Our own records were practically non-existent, as previously they'd given no cause for investigation. We didn't even know whether there was a Nazi party among the big German community, that's the big German community in Calcutta, or what the relation was between the Germans, Italians, and Japanese following the formation of the Axis. So I think, finally, before I wrap up, this is also a reminder of how cosmopolitan or international and diverse, actually, a lot of these places were. There were many Europeans of different nationalities living in these European cities, obviously very much the case in Singapore and Hong Kong, but also in Calcutta. And this led to people being interned, but also a lot of kind of people who weren't easily classified and weren't easily surveyed. So within that context, I think questions of citizenship and nationality kind of raised their head. And it was also not always very possible to actually identify who was who and who belonged to which side. So this is, I suppose, what I'm suggesting, quite a fuzzy and difficult crossroads of great power challenges, with a massive area at stake, a huge region at stake, but one which has often been overlaid by stories, I think, which focus on the Chindits or the European POWs at Changi, which are all really sort of powerful, interesting stories. And also, of course, those big battles fought by the 14th Army at places like Imphal and Kohima, huge important battles which were fought in the struggle to take back Burma. But I think we have had a tendency to perhaps sort of overemphasize some of those stories and forget others, and to perhaps move away from, perhaps what I'm suggesting is we might move away from horrible and destructive war at the time. I think I will hand over now to Ashley, and well, back to Kevin, and then over to Ashley.
Thank you, Yasmin. Yes. Ashley?
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin, and good evening, everyone who's watching. I'm not an intelligence historian. This burden is going to be borne alone, I think, by David. But what I would say is, in looking at this area, some of you will be familiar with texts on this, and the ones I'm thinking of in particular are Alan Stripp's famous Codebreaker in the Far East, and Richard Aldrich's work on intelligence and the war against Japan, which again is very good at looking at both British and American aspects. And of course, Michael Smith's work on the Emperor's New Codes, as he put it, looking specifically at Bletchley, but also other aspects of intelligence and the war against Japan in this region. So although not an intelligence historian, you might ask, why on earth am I here? What I'd like to argue is that as a student of the British Empire in the Second World War, one can't help but encounter disparate intelligence gathering facilities and activities in distant colonies, the kind of areas, islands, continents, and all of the rest of it across the East of Suez region that Yasmin has mentioned, all linked to Britain, all linked to Bletchley and its endeavours in many ways. And crucially, to emphasise what Yasmin was saying, forming vital nuts and bolts in the vast global machinery of Allied intelligence gathering, dissemination, and therefore war fighting. So what my work has done, very similar to Yasmin, and we've shared projects and works before, is really seeking to develop a better understanding of the manner in which Britain's war, inverted commas, was intimately linked to and supported by a vast imperial structure, and how it depended on the people, the lands, and the resources of colonial territories across the globe. So in order to orchestrate a global war effort in terms of generating fighting power, prosecuting offensive and defensive military operations, managing complex systems of logistics, administration, and intelligence gathering, and attempting to continue to conduct world trade and communications, the participation of colonial peoples and the use of their resources, including requisitioned land, extant and new infrastructure, was absolutely crucial. And for our purposes, this included an astonishingly extensive network of intelligence gathering and dissemination infrastructure in colonies and dominions, meaning buildings, barracks, offices, all of the equipment necessary within them, the deployment there of men and women from the UK and other parts of the Commonwealth, and also crucially, these people being supplemented in British uniforms by people drawn from places like Ceylon, Mauritius, Kenya, India, you name it. So what I can do is focus on some examples from the work that I've done on places like, when we think about the Indian Ocean area, before we even get to the Pacific, we are talking about the Persian Gulf, we're talking about the Red Sea, the Mozambique Channel, the Southern Ocean, the Bay of Bengal. This is an enormous area, and it is absolutely vital for the Allies' prosecution of the war and the defence of the Allied position from the enemy. So first of all, I want to look at different types of intelligence, because it certainly isn't all about classic images associated with Bletchley Park, code breaking, translation of intercepted information, and that kind of thing. You've got things like meteorological intelligence, vital for the prosecution of operations. This is being gathered from even the most sort of barren tropical outcrops in the middle of the Indian Ocean as it's being gathered back at home. You've got extensive efforts around the entire empire, leading to huge growth of the colonial state in things like the censorship of mail. So the censorship of people's letters home and all of the rest of it is a very important source of intelligence. You've also got the vital aspect of human intelligence. So in this region, for example, the endless patrolling of flying boats, of submarines, of surface vessels, reconnaissance and more reconnaissance was often the only way, or one of the only ways, in which to try and gather intelligence about the enemy and to protect your own assets, sea lines of communication, etc. In her book Cipher Officer, Elizabeth Watkins, some of you will know of this woman, she's unfortunately dead now, she was of this parish. She describes her time in the Seychelles as part of what was known as Allied Surveillance Net East, all of these little nuts and bolts of the intelligence war against the enemy. Now what this was, it was a chain of Catalina flying boats based in places like Colombo, through the Seychelles, across other islands in the Indian Ocean, flying below Japanese radar cover, providing very, very important reconnaissance intelligence that for many parts of the war, its most crucial stages, was often the only intelligence being gathered about Japanese movements in the Indian Ocean region. Flying boat bases all over the place, lagoons in South Africa, dusty airstrips in the Horn of Africa, bases in Aden, Bombay, Diego Garcia, the development of this infrastructure that would enable the Allies to gather, in this case, reconnaissance, flight-derived intelligence. We then also get things like translation and interrogation centres. So Mountbatten's SEAC command that Yasmin has mentioned had a translation and interrogation centre in Ceylon. It would try and basically, how can I put it, kidnap people off of junks off the Malay coast. It would get a few Japanese POWs and try and derive intelligence. So the use of local bases and facilities to support this British-centred wider global war effort. You've also got a lot of intelligence derived from behind enemy lines special force ops. So the kind of SOE Force 136, MI6 things, you know, Freddie Spencer Chapman kind of stuff, insert by submarine, Gustav operations often run from places like Ceylon to try and glean information from behind enemy lines that could then be wireless beamed to intelligence centres like Ceylon, processed and moved on back to the UK or other major centres around the world. You even have things, again, based in places like Ceylon, things like the Operation of Strategic Services, the CIA forerunner. They're doing things like beach and river insertions on the Burmese coast so that they can try and get this kind of intelligence that is necessary for when Allied forces begin re-invasions and reoccupations. What's interesting to note here is that in many parts of this region, as elsewhere in the world, when these American assets go in, often quite late in the war, they are they're more interested in the political intelligence about what their rivals intend to do post-war, either the British and the Soviets, as they are about actually fighting the German or the Japanese enemy. So the use of colonial bases, infrastructure, insertions from, in order to gather vital political intelligence, making decisions back in Washington and elsewhere. You've also got a lot of activity in neutral countries. So think about people like Malcolm Muggeridge sweating it out in the capital of Portuguese East Africa. What's he trying to do? Well, he's trying to gather intelligence and counter the intelligence gathering activities of Axis agents in this neutral Portuguese territory, now Mozambique, in order to protect British and Allied shipping. Also to try and counter German infiltration into South Africa. Famously, we have things like Operation Creek, which is the famous SOE Calcutta Light Horse operation run from Calcutta all the way around to Portuguese neutral Goa to knock out German vessels there that are sending signals to German submarines in the Indian Ocean, again, seeking to interdict British and Allied shipping. So these intelligence efforts are all absolutely vital, as are things like intelligence derived from enemy radio broadcasts. So think about the wonderful BBC Monitoring Service archive, where you've got the British listening in to enemy propaganda broadcasts in Urdu, in Persian, maybe aimed at Australian civilians in terms of how they're looking after or not looking after their prisoners of war in a place like the Dutch East Indies. So again, all of this kind of intelligence that is helping form the picture back in the UK and in other major centres of the Allied war effort. And it's also worth, I think, conceiving of intelligence in terms of just trying to improve our own or the Allies' own capacity to communicate successfully. So, for example, in the East Africa campaign, one of the main reasons for this is to not only gain, if you like, maritime security in the vital Red Sea, Mozambique Channel, Swahili Coast region, but it's also to gain other assets. So, for example, as soon as the Allies have pushed the Italians out of Eritrea, the Americans come in and, among other things, they set up, the US Army Signal Corps sets up radio stations in order to help relay signals going from Karachi back to Washington. So in terms of Ceylon, in my last minute and a half, what you've got in Ceylon is you've got this fallback of British intelligence gathering HQs as the Japanese advance. So you've lost Hong Kong, you've lost Singapore, Ceylon becomes a surrogate. So Far East Combined Bureau, very much one of these Bletchley outstations, is based in Colombo, HMS Anderson. There's also one in Kilindini, on Mombasa Island in Kenya, which becomes important when even Ceylon has to be retreated from between 1942 and 1944. These are units working very closely with Bletchley Park, with US naval signal stations, and an infrastructure that's embracing Melbourne, Brisbane, Darwin, Calcutta, South China, and all of the rest of it. HMS Anderson is mainly looking at Japanese naval codes, JN25. You've got Wireless Experimental Center in Delhi, mainly looking at land and air, Japanese traffic. And these are big institutions. Anderson in Colombo comes to have 1,500 staff by 1944. And crucially, many of these are women. I mean, many of these are British women, local women, brought in to help run these installations. The intelligence there is very, very useful in terms of prosecuting military operations, but it's also often used to, if you like, cross-check and work with human intelligence. So when the Japanese famously raid Ceylon in April 42, you had a Bletchley Park message that has come in telling you that you're about to be attacked. You don't know exactly when it is, but you're able to get the fleet out and therefore avoid what would have been the biggest surface engagement since Jutland. But it's actually the human intelligence that is provided by a Royal Canadian Air Force flying boat, then shot down, that gets a fix on where Admiral Nagumo's fleet is as it steams towards the ports and harbours of Ceylon and India. You're also using a lot of this Bletchley-derived intelligence for specific operations, for finding out about, for example, the concentration of U-boat wolf packs that are trying to interdict vital shipping lanes across the Indian Ocean, and then later in the war to be hunting Japanese assets, trying to keep their armies supplied as they are increasingly forced onto the back foot. And so hunting in the Bay of Bengal and off the Malay barrier. Finally, Mauritius, another great one. Mauritius, just these tiny places that become part of this global war effort, in this case for intelligence. What we have there is we have Sir Edward Twining, as he later becomes governor of Tanganyika. At the time, he's chief censor in Mauritius and the government's intelligence officer. What he's asked to do is establish something that becomes known as the Wireless Interception Service, coming to employ around 300 people, many of them well-to-do Mauritian women from the Franco-Mauritian community. And what they're doing is they're intercepting particularly Vichy traffic as well as Japanese traffic in this region. They're very, very useful in doing things like helping when the British come to invade Madagascar in May 42. Along with SOE forces that are deployed ahead of this. You also have on Mauritius a Y station, wireless interception station, that ends up having about 100 operators, 24 sets, handling 1,500 messages per day from the Far East, intercepting traffic between Japan and Europe, from occupied Malaya, Dutch East Indies, Indochina, Siam, etc. So essentially what we have here, and as I finish, we have an enormous intelligence effort connected to the major hubs like Bletchley, of course, but involving physical infrastructure, assets, people, resources, territory throughout this vast region. And it's in many ways is, as Churchill says about the whole global war effort, it is a prodigy of skill and organization.
Thank you very much, Ashley. That's a great overview of that broader intelligence context, as well as some of the details of some of the sites and so on involved. I know you mentioned Alan Stripp earlier in his book Codebreaker in the Far East, and it's very interesting way he was at Bletchley originally, and then of course went out to India and was, I think he was based in Delhi or New Delhi, that area, for the last 1 or 2 years of war. But the way that all of these different sites interacted and became part of that broad network that allowed the gathering of all that information is really, really interesting. So our next speaker is Dr. David Kenyon. So over to you, David.
Thank you. We've had a lovely broad description from Ashley there of the imperial intelligence network, if you like. I think also, in order to understand this fully, you have to step outside the empire and the Commonwealth a bit and look at what else is going on. And in this context, there was a very important anniversary that took place last Friday, which did make the press in some places, but many of you may not have noticed, which was the 75th anniversary of the UK-USA agreement. And I'll get to why this is relevant in a minute. This was the agreement that was signed in 1946 between the UK and the US signals intelligence agencies, and subsequently joined by Canada, Australia, New Zealand to become the slightly infamous Five Eyes that we all know about from Edward Snowden a couple of years ago. In fact, it was fully declassified in 2010. But why is that important? Well, that relationship, the relationship between Britain and the UK and the USA on signals intelligence and intelligence more broadly, is founded on a relationship that is built during the Second World War. And it's built, it has quite an awkward birth. The building of that relationship is not easy or quick. And the relationship between the signals intelligence assets that Bletchley Park, the Government Code and Cipher School, Far East Combined Bureau have in India and Asia are a crucial part of that relationship building. But also, we've heard from Ashley how large the signals intelligence organizations out there were. You know, FECB or HMS Anderson has something like 1,500 staff by the end of the war. You have nearly 1,000 people working at Bletchley on Japanese codes and ciphers. You have the people in Delhi. You have Abbottabad. It's a vast organization. And it tends to be, the myth of Bletchley Park is that all bits of Bletchley Park do really, really important things, and it's all fantastic. And in a way, you'd expect me as the public face of Bletchley Park to say exactly that. But actually, in this context, I'm going to say something slightly different, because you have to look quite critically at the signals intelligence effort of the Allies in the East to see whether what Bletchley's doing is actually any use. And what you find out is actually quite interesting, because in the early period, FECB is set up in 1934. British and US efforts, well, British efforts against the Japanese in particular in the 1930s are very successful. They're able to read a lot of naval traffic, they're able to read a lot of diplomatic traffic. And for example, during the naval negotiations of the 20s and 30s, they are reading the Japanese delegations' messages with great felicity. They're also reading the Americans' delegations' messages as well, but they tend not to mention that so much. And so as you go forward to the outbreak of the war in Europe, although not yet in the Far East, this code breaking goes on as a more or less a partnership operation. And indeed, in 1941, the first shades of signals intelligence collaboration between the UK and the USA start with the Sinkoff visit to Bletchley Park. And as part of that agreement, they start directly sharing basically breakages of Japanese naval codes in particular between Singapore and latterly Colombo and the American places in the Philippines and latterly in Australia. And that all goes very well. But by 1942, you see quite a substantial change in this, in the balance of power, if you like, and in the relationship. Increasingly, the Americans have been more and more chary about sharing what they know about Japanese code breaking. And in particular, the operation in Melbourne, Frumel, is run by an American by the name of Rudy Fabian, who is absolutely opposed to sharing anything outside US circles. And he tries to basically have all the non-Americans working at Melbourne sacked. And the relationship starts to deteriorate from that point on. And the story of the next few years really is a story of negotiation, transatlantic negotiation, and iterations of agreements between the various powers, between the UK, and they have to be tripartite agreements as well, because the US Navy and the US War Department, the Army, don't like to collaborate with each other. So Bletchley has to talk to the US Navy separately from its negotiations with the US Army. And actually the UCUSA agreement is significant in that it's the first time that all of the American signals intelligence agencies separately sign the same agreement with the British. So the negotiating process is quite difficult. And actually one of the first agreements is in October 1942, a thing called the Holden Agreement, where the British slightly reluctantly give the Americans full access to European work on Enigma and Italian ciphers and various other bits and pieces. But in exchange for that, they get a lot of support on Japanese systems from the Americans. But at the same time, they sign up to an agreement which says that they will no longer try and independently break Japanese codes, to put it simply. The agreement says that GC&CS will withdraw from active cryptanalytical work on Japanese naval codes, except for research. And the quid pro quo is that the US will supply them with all the intelligence they need derived from the American code-breaking effort, which is taking place on a large scale in Washington, DC, but on a lesser scale in Hawaii and also in Australia, and eventually makes its way back to the Philippines as the war turns in the Allies' favour. But this presents a problem for the British because they clearly don't want to just give up doing Japanese code breaking. They want to have a hand in the game as far as possible for the rest of the war. And this tension continues for the next 3 years, where the Americans have promised to share intelligence where it's pertinent to British operations. So they say, you only need to know what we find out about the Indian Ocean. You don't need to know about the Pacific. But equally, their SIGINT agencies are not particularly interested in the Indian Ocean themselves, so they're not generating any intelligence to share with the British. And so while it has been agreed that the British won't do their own SIGINT, they're kind of forced to do it. So HMS Anderson reaches the size it does, despite rather than because of the agreement with the Americans. They're being forced back on doing their own code breaking because they're not getting the supply they need. Equally, there's this ever-growing effort at Bletchley Park itself, and this focuses on both Japanese naval stuff, JN-25, but also on Army Air and Army stuff in Burma. The naval side is particularly interesting because most of what this unit do is not very helpful. The Americans share out the work, and the principal unit working on JN-25 at Bletchley, for example, because the Japanese change their code books as often as every 6 weeks, in some cases towards the end of the war. For the whole of 1945, the JN-25 team at Bletchley are working on back traffic from the summer of 1944. They're working in some cases on messages that are over a year old. And you have to say, why are they doing this? What is the intelligence value of this? And the intelligence value of this is pretty low. In the air section, by contrast, they're doing much more useful work. The breaking of a Japanese Army air system called 6633 was very important. And they were able to, particularly in Delhi, break Japanese air codes almost in real time, which allowed Japanese bombing raids to be intercepted. And it was a very sort of up to the minute operation. But again, this is kind of at odds with what they've agreed with the Americans. So what does it all add up to? Well, what's the point of it? Having argued that Bletchley, GCNCS, FECB is not making a big contribution to the signals intelligence picture, that basically the Americans are providing most of the intelligence. Why would an organization like GCNCS invest huge amounts of personnel and effort in doing this? And the solutions are, the answers are sort of threefold. On one level, as I've said, particularly with Japanese Army and Air, they are having a significant military effect. They are producing useful intelligence, which is helping to win the war against the Japanese. But two other things which are also very important and bring us back to Yakuza are going on. The first is that Bletchley has to maintain a strategic capability against these kinds of codes and ciphers. If they were to give up Japanese work altogether, within a year or two, they would be out of the picture. Their knowledge would be out of date. So it's fundamental that they keep the skill set alive and they do as much work as they can, because they can't rely on the Americans to keep contributing this material. And indeed, in the Yakuza Agreement in 1945 is all about continuing the intelligence relationship when the obvious purpose of it, being World War II, has disappeared. And in order for that to happen, the British still have to be perceived as useful contributors to the game. So that's maintenance of capability is very important. And the other thing is simple alliance politics. You have to have some things you can offer if you want to get things in exchange. And so when you look at signals intelligence in particular, but intelligence more broadly in the Asian theatre, its purpose is not just to support the immediate war effort. There are inter-allied politics which underlie a lot of this. And when you ask why they're doing what they're doing, you have to look outside the Empire and the Commonwealth to our allies and see what the hidden agenda is, if you like. I'll finish there.
Oh, brilliant. That was really interesting. So I certainly hadn't fully appreciated that sort of broader context in terms of what the Americans were doing and so on. So yeah, that's great. Now, what we're going to do now is move on to questions. And I would reiterate what I was saying at the beginning. We have sort of two approaches here. We have our chat function. And if people would like to put questions in there, I can read them out. Also, if you would like to ask a question in person, then please just indicate it in there as well. So the chat function is found at the bottom of the screen, at the bottom of the Zoom window. So please use that to highlight questions. But while sort of people are kind of gathering their thoughts, I would sort of put in my own question first, because it's something that's actually come up as part of my own research, because part of my background reading for what I was doing, I was looking at the campaigns in Burma, particularly those in 44 and 45. So what I noticed that General Slim, in his book Defeat into Victory, actually complains about the lack of available intelligence. Now, the publication date of Defeat into Victory would have been, I'm imagining, sort of 1956, that sort of time. So clearly he couldn't have sort of talked about the sort of signals intelligence that might have been available. Now, Louis Allen, in his book Burma, the Longest War, which I think is probably the definitive account of the campaigns in 1944 and 45 in Burma and so on, that he interpreted Slim's complaints as being about a lack of signals intelligence, about him not being given it. Now, Allen is I mean, he's highly regarded, and his opinion needs to be sort of taken seriously. So, but still, my question here is this likely? Because I would have thought that a figure such as Slim would certainly have had full access to the sort of signals intelligence that you'd have expected to come out of these types of sources. Which obviously opens up the other question, well, what would it be otherwise? But I'd be very interested in what your views are here in terms of, and that's certainly to you, David, and also Ashley, it sort of plays into this broader question, who was seeing this? I mean, we've talked about how it might have been gathered and so on, and some of the politics involved. But when it comes to the actual use of this material, who's actually seeing it? Because I would have thought it must have included someone like General Slim. So I'm sort of puzzled by why, you know, a historian like Louis Allen might have thought that was not the case.
My immediate answer would be, it is extremely likely that somebody of Slim's stature would have been indoctrinated into magic, the American term is magic, into special intelligence, as it's called, with a big S and a big I. If there was special intelligence available, he was of a grade to expect it. But the question then becomes, what intelligence is available for him to see? And my understanding of the work, that the successful work that's being done in Burma, is of things like 6633 and Bulbul, the kind of systems that Bletchley Park are breaking are actually quite tactical. They're quite low level. And so they're providing information which allows you to fight the battle. Sort of, you know, when a Japanese bomber squadron is because they would base their squadrons down in Thailand, and then they would only fly them up to Burma when they wanted to make a raid, and then they'd fly back again. But if you can spot them on the leg to their jumping off point, then you can intercept them. But unlike in the European theatre, where both Enigma and the Lorenz Fish intelligence, in some cases you're getting really high level intercepts. You're reading messages from, you know, von Rundstedt to Hitler and things like that. There's less of that kind of really high level strategic information being broken in the Pacific theatre or in the Indian Ocean theatre, even though they are reading Japanese diplomatic traffic as well. So I can understand Slim being frustrated that he's not getting intelligence, but that may not, it won't necessarily be because it's not being shared with him. It may be because it doesn't exist to share with him in the first place.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. I see. Does that make more sense in terms of what Louis Allen was saying then? Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I'm not aware of intercepted systems that are on the Japanese side that are equivalent to some of the high-level intercepts that are going on with the Germans, for example.
No, I mean, as I understood, the Japanese sort of code arena, or whatever, however you want to put it, was much more fragmented than it was in the German case. Is that correct? Because there seems to be lots of these different code systems, just in the research I've done.
They have
them, in the German case, they seem to have Enigma, and they seem to use that fairly consistently. Is that correct? And
yes. The difference as well is, as I didn't have time to sort of fully expound upon, the Japanese use large numbers of book codes as opposed to ciphers or mechanical. They use some mechanical ciphers for diplomatic work, but most of their JN25, for example, it's a book code. So you have a thing like a dictionary where every word is represented by a number. So you get your message and you turn it into numbers. But then in addition to that, you then have what's called an additive book, where you take a second 5-digit number and you add it to the first number, and that produces your encrypted version of the message. But what that means is, sorry, that's a very simple, rushed explanation. But so you have two books. You have the dictionary and you have the numbers that you add on. They change those books on a very, very frequent basis. So unlike Enigma, where once you've got a methodology for breaking it and you've built 100 bomb machines and everything else, you can break it on a fairly reliable basis. Japanese ciphers, firstly, they have huge numbers of these systems. They're broadly similar, but they all work slightly differently. But also they change them on a very, very frequent basis. And if they're changing the JN25 additive book every 6 weeks, it means you have to start the breaking process all over again every 6 weeks. So it's a very laborious, labor-intensive task to read any of this stuff. The Japanese help the Allies by the fact that they can't actually keep up with their own supply of books to their own forces. So people are forever using out-of-date systems and using the wrong book with another book and this kind of thing. So they make themselves vulnerable in all sorts of ways, but it's still highly complicated.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's an interesting question in chat, which may link to that in a way, I'm not sure. So this is from Richard Stevens, and says, does the nature of the Japanese written language constrain the type of codes they can use?
Yes and no. The Japanese language, if you're using a book code where, let's look at JN25, where you have groups of, you have 5-digit numbers, and every one of those 5-digit numbers can represent either a word or a phrase or anything else useful that you might want. It might represent, and you can also use it as spellers, as alphabetical characters to write out words that aren't in your dictionary. So from that point of view, you can create a book code from Japanese just the same as you can from any other language. But also they use the Kana syllabary, which has far fewer characters in it. It has something like 48 characters in it, which is less exact because it's based on pronunciation rather than the characters. But you can encrypt that relatively easily. And in fact, they have their own version of Morse code that allows them to transmit Japanese language in Kana symbols. So if you're a Western interceptor, if you're sitting in Mauritius or wherever else, one of the first things you have to do is learn this new Morse code, because you can't use Western Morse code because it won't apply.
That's very.
On the other hand, in the early days, the Japanese, there was a certain amount of cultural arrogance that they thought if they spoke Japanese, it would conceal their traffic because nobody else spoke Japanese anyway. Which was kind of true, because in 1939, or 1941, the British have a massive problem trying to find enough people who speak Japanese. Anyway, but actually, the irony of something like JN25 is you don't need to speak Japanese in order to break it, because if you have a 5-digit number representing the word maru, which is merchant ship, you can just translate that 5-digit number as the English word ship. You don't ever need the Japanese word. So you don't actually need to speak Japanese to break code in the first place. Sorry, long answer to a simple question.
No, but it's actually very interesting. There was, just in terms of the numbers of people who could speak Japanese, it was obviously very, very limited, wasn't it? Which was a key constraint at Bletchley. But it was also a key constraint for the military in general, because I know for one of the division, going back to Slim and his issues with this sort of thing, one of his divisions, when they were crossing the Irrawaddy in 1945, assault crossing there, the entire division only had 2 Japanese speakers in it. So, and they had to do all any interrogations, any looking at documents and so on. But it just shows how constrained they were in terms of the language resources. So, which must have been a really, really difficult problem for them. Another question from chat.
Actually, he's got his hand up there, I think.
Oh, right. Oh, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Thanks, David. I couldn't find the button on the screen that puts an enormous yellow hand on it for me. Yeah, no, just really some of the things that fascinating that David's been talking about, and just to add something to those things. And this context is obviously hugely important. I mean, the fact is the British and the Americans are rival commercial empires. And so, you know, the difficulties of this relationship in any form, intelligence or anything else, are enormous. And so in many ways, the fact that it works so well is significant and notable, but the fractures within it are hugely important. And one of the reasons the British want to be doing this is because they want to do things themselves, even when they can see that their resources are much more constrained, that the Americans are going through the stratosphere in terms of building Liberty ships, or, you know, getting personnel into various theatres in any respect. The British want to be there too. The Americans don't want the British to be there, particularly in the Pacific. You know, they don't want the British Pacific Fleet. They take it for political reasons, and it's given by the British for political reasons. You know, the whole British commitment that would have seen British imperial forces, many Indians storming ashore on the Japanese home islands if the atom bombs hadn't been dropped. This was for post-war politics, more than actually beating the enemy. So the British want skin in the game in every single game post-war. The Americans wants to do away with many aspects of Britain's sort of our challenge around the world and build their own new world order as well. And so this issue of competition is hugely important. You see it across the empire in all sorts of respects as America sort of begins to seethe and you know sort of bubble across British territories. But I think the other thing that's really important is just this idea that in any of these major overseas, if you like, communications, intelligence, warfighting, political administrative hubs, is you've got loads of cooks with their oars in the broth. On the British side, you will have, say, the ambassador in Cairo saying, I used to be the ruler here, but now the general officer commanding's got a big voice, then the Navy's got a big voice, then political warfare wants to do this, SOE wants to do that, MI6 are doing this, now the Americans are here and they're wanting power on this, and they brought all of their economic assets, and so this confused picture is a part and parcel of these kinds of overseas hubs and relationships. The fact I would emphasize is that they work really successfully despite their difficulties, and you only want to look at the same on the Axis side to see just how bad it could be. You know, the fact is the Grand Alliance and all the rest of it, despite its difficulties, and as David will know all the stuff about D-Day, when we look at D-Day essays, it's all about why didn't the Allies do this? What was the relationship between Montgomery and Eisenhower? It's like, yeah, that's fine, look at that. But this was really successful overall, despite its fractures and difficulties, especially compared to the enemy inability to forge these kinds of alliances. And then just on your Slim point, Kevin, I think one of the things here is that it's almost, I mean, I think one of the things bothering him, it's intelligence, but it's also just, it's almost like political leads. The fact it's being set, you've got so many objectives there, and this is a theatre of requirements. You know, this is not the theatre where the enemy is going to be beaten. Burma is not a strategic theatre. It might be important for British prestige and all the rest of it, but it's really not important. It's one of the reasons why the Americans don't buy into it very much, apart from supplying the Chinese, which for them is strategically hugely important. So what you've got the British is not only if you've got looking down to people like Slim, he's got his relationship with SEAC and Mountbatten, how you're getting the intelligence, the SLUs from Kandy out into the field, all those kinds of things. But then you've got this battle happening back in Whitehall between the chiefs of staff and Churchill about where our main effort east of Suez should be. Should it be getting stuff into the Pacific to support the Americans, or should it be regaining imperial territory? Then you've got the battles between the Navy and the Army, and so almost on the home side, as it were. You've got lots of frustrations. You know, should we invade the Andaman Islands? You know, Roosevelt likes this idea. Some of the British don't. It's an absolute waste of resources. You know, if you're wasting men and women's lives for something that's really, really infinitesimally small, but it serves a bigger political aspect. And then within that theatre, you've got the fact that the Americans are increasingly controlling the kit, aren't they? They're controlling the landing ships, tanks, and all of those kind of vital assets through which you're going to mount Zipper and those kinds of things. And so I think that the frustrations, you know, are almost in terms of political direction and intelligence, as much as, if you like, from the ground up, what's the enemy doing?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Another question from chat, because I'm conscious that we're running out of time here. How did the Japanese intelligence efforts compare with those of the Allies? That's a very interesting question. I don't know who feels able to take a lead on that one.
I'll have a stab at it before David gives us the proper answer. Again, I would say not very well. And probably increasingly bad as the war goes on. I think it's partly because of the contraction of their war effort. So not only, you know, it's almost like in the, and again, you know, I'm really talking on a limb and out the top of my hat here, but I just get this sense with the Japanese of if your political military interface is just so skew with, you're going to make all sorts of really bad mistakes. So, for example, if you don't adequately protect your merchant shipping because your commanders are told that really, you know, attacking enemy warships is the thing to do, not protect shipping, that really isn't a very glamorous thing to do. You're almost like building into a relationship, a political military interface, a lot of problems. If you can't decide, for example, in early 1942, when you've got the wind in your sails for that brief precious moment, how you're going to operate against the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific and Indian Ocean. You know, they don't do Operation C, the attack on Bay of Bengal port, Ceylon, as well as they should. And by the time that they think they might have done it better, Midway's happened and they're having to redistribute assets closer to home because they're beginning to suffer defeats. And so I think you've got a system there that really isn't working very well. It's not geared to work very well, notwithstanding the difficulties that the Allies have within their systems. But in saying all of that, I think David will know more about, you know, the successes that the Japanese do have in terms of you know, breaking Allied codes and then using that intelligence, which is obviously more important than gathering it.
David?
I mean, I would have to confess a certain amount of ignorance on this one. I'm not particularly familiar with Japanese efforts against Allied codes in particular. They are doing quite a lot of work with radio intelligence, so direction finding and traffic analysis and that sort of thing, which is separate from pure cryptography, but it's basically working out where your enemy's transmissions are coming from. Interestingly enough, they have a code system which is only used by direction finding stations for reporting the locations of Allied ships and transmitters. Bletchley Park identifies this code, and it's very easy to break because all the messages look the same, but it doesn't actually tell you anything because it tells you where your own ships are. So they don't put a lot of effort into it. But it is notable that the Japanese are not particularly effective in applying their signals intelligence. I mean, the massacre, and it is a massacre, of Japanese convoy traffic, particularly in 1944, stands in stark contrast to the efforts that, and the quite joined up effort that the Allies are able to put in, certainly at the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific theatre, into convoy protection. And it was a disease of all navies before the war that they didn't think convoy protection was particularly sexy, and they thought fighting other nations' warships was what it was all about. The Japanese Navy suffers from that problem throughout the war, and so it's successful intelligence is also about customers. If the people you're supplying the intelligence to aren't interested in it, or don't want it, or don't act on it, it's not very helpful. So the overall Japanese military and Japanese Navy attitude to that kind of intelligence makes what they're doing a lot less effective than it might otherwise have been.
No, it's interesting. It also fits in with other aspects of Japanese strategy. So the excellent submarine fleet, which was basically frittered away, whereas if it had been directed against Allied shipping, it could have caused serious issues for them. But unfortunately, I think we are coming to the sort of end of time here, unfortunately. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers this evening. It's been very interesting, and it was a great pleasure chairing the event. So thank you for everyone who came, and thank you for everyone who spoke.
Pleasure.